Welcome back to the deep dive. Looks like you guys sent in some articles about this U.S. government funding bill that just barely made it through. We're going to take a closer look at what went down, why it matters, and what it could tell us about what's ahead.
Yeah, you've got these two pieces here, one from The Guardian and one from the BBC. Both of them talk about this recent Senate vote. But sounds like you're interested in the bigger picture, like the political forces behind it all and the potential consequences.
Exactly. Both articles mentioned how controversial this bill was, even though it passed and stopped a government shutdown. What jumped out at you when you first looked at these articles?
Well, the vote itself, is pretty interesting. It passed 54 to 46 in the Senate. But it wasn't just a straightforward party line vote. 10 Democrats actually voted with the Republicans to get it through. But then you see almost all the House Democrats opposed it. I think it shows just how complicated this whole thing is.
That is interesting because on the surface, it seems like avoiding a government shutdown would be something everyone would want. What do you think is causing this divide, especially within the Democratic Party?
Well, the articles suggest a couple of things. First, there's this fear of what a shutdown would mean with all this talk about potential government restructuring. They specifically mention Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE.
Wait, hold on. Doge, that sounds more like some internet meme than actual government policy.
Right. It's definitely a name that grabs your attention. But what it stands for is this idea of streamlining the government with AI and tech, or, some Democrats might say, downsizing it. The article suggests that Musk's DOGE initiative wants some pretty big changes, and some Democrats worry that a shutdown would give them more power to do that.
So it's almost like they're playing chicken, hoping to avoid changes they see as harmful in the future, even if it means accepting a bill they don't totally like right now.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And you can see that tension in how different Democrats reacted. Schumer, for example, says they stopped things from being even worse by preventing a shutdown. But then you have AOC, who's angry and says Schumer gave in to the Republicans. It's a tough situation. Compromise to avoid immediate problems or stand firm even if things might get worse.
Wow, it's a real split. The Guardian even mentions that almost every single House Democrat voted against the bill, which seems to underline that they're willing to take a stand even if there might be consequences.
Exactly. And it shows something important that goes beyond this particular bill. We're seeing how people like Elon Musk and the tech world are changing the traditional political battle lines. It's not just about Democrats versus Republicans anymore.
That's an interesting thought. I hadn't really considered it that way before. So for someone like me trying to keep up with all of this, what would you say is the key takeaway here?
I think the main thing is that this bill is just one fight in a much bigger struggle over the size and role of the U.S. government in the 21st century. You have Democrats, especially progressives, who believe the government needs to play a big part in providing services, regulating industries, and protecting vulnerable people. And then you have this push for a smaller government, more efficiency, and a bigger role for technology, which people like Musk are advocating for. And all of this is happening right now, potentially with big consequences for everyone.
It's a lot to process, especially this whole Doge thing. It's still pretty unclear to me. What are they actually proposing, and why are Democrats so worried about it?
Well, the articles don't go into too much detail, but they suggest DOGE is pushing for some pretty big changes to government agencies, maybe using AI and automation to make things more, efficient. Now, some people might think that sounds great, but Democrats are afraid this could lead to essential services getting privatized, algorithmic bias in decision-making, and basically a government that's less accountable and less fair.
So it's not just about saving money or cutting red tape. It's a fundamental change in how the government operates and who it ultimately serves.
Exactly. And the fact that this is happening with a funding bill that barely passed, and with all the division within the Democratic Party itself, just shows how complicated and, well, kind of scary these changes are. This is about way more than just keeping the government funded.
Okay, that definitely helps me understand what's at stake here. It sounds like this bill is just a small part of something much bigger and potentially much more important.
Absolutely. And getting these underlying dynamics will be essential as we watch how these changes unfold in the months and years to come.
We're back, and, I'm still thinking about what you said about this funding bill being a sign of bigger changes coming. It's not just Democrats versus Republicans anymore. It's about how tech and people like Elon Musk are changing what government even means.
It is a really important point. And, I think as we look closer at the potential impact of this bill, we'll see that playing out even more. So let's talk about those consequences. What kind of immediate effects might we see now that this bill is passed?
Well, the most obvious one is that the government didn't shut down, at least for now, but I'm guessing there's more to it than just that. The BBC article mentions specific increases in military spending and cuts to non-defense funding. What will that actually look like, in reality?
Yeah, the increased military spending is probably going to make those who want a strong national defense happy. But as you said, there's a trade-off. Even though the articles are a bit vague on the specifics, the cuts to non-defense funding could have a pretty big impact on various government programs.
So do we have any idea what might be on the chopping block?
Well, in the past, cuts to non-defense spending have often targeted things like social services, education, environmental protection, and scientific research. These are all areas that Democrats usually prioritize, which is why they're so concerned about this bill and what it could mean down the road.
So we could be looking at cuts to everything from like healthcare and food assistance to funding for national parks and climate change initiatives. That's a pretty wide range of potential impacts.
It is, yeah. And it's something we need to watch closely. The articles don't give a detailed breakdown, but these cuts could have a big ripple effect and touch the lives of millions of Americans in many different ways.
And we haven't even talked about the longer-term consequences. The Guardian article mentioned some concerns about what this might mean for the IRS.
Oh, that's an important one. The IRS, of course, plays a vital role in collecting taxes, making sure the government has the resources to operate. If they're underfunded, they might have trouble enforcing tax laws effectively, which could potentially lead to a bigger budget deficit in the future.
So this isn't just about immediate cuts to certain programs. It could impact government finances and the whole economy in the long term.
Exactly. This fight over funding shows how interconnected all these different parts of the government are, and how even small changes can have big, unexpected consequences.
Okay, so we've discussed the direct impact on how the government works and its funding. But how might this bill affect the political landscape going forward? Could this whole experience, with all the drama and division, actually lead to more gridlock and polarization between the parties?
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. The very heated debate around this bill and the divisions within the Democratic Party could make it even harder to find common ground on laws in the future.
So this could be a sign of even more partisan fighting in Congress, further eroding people's trust in government, which, as you mentioned earlier, is already pretty low.
It's a real worry. However, there's always a chance this experience could be a wake-up call for both parties.
You mean like a reminder that they need to find ways to work together for the good of the country, even if they don't see eye to eye on everything?
Precisely. But whether they actually listen to that call is another question. Only time will tell. The next few months will be critical in figuring out where U.S. politics is headed and whether we'll see more cooperation or even more division.
Speaking of the future, we haven't really touched on what this means for Elon Musk and his Doge thing. You mentioned that Democrats are especially concerned about their influence on how the government is structured. Is that something we could see happening in the long run?
It's something to keep an eye on for sure. Musk's vision for Doge, even though the articles don't fully explain it, seems to fit with this idea of a smaller, more efficient government. It's not crazy to think we could see more attempts to streamline or even shrink government agencies, particularly after this funding bill.
So we might see a more tech-driven, streamlined government. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a tough question to answer. It depends on who you ask and how these changes actually happen. There's certainly a possibility of making things more efficient and saving money, but there are also concerns about transparency, accountability, and potential job losses. And of course, there's the risk of algorithmic bias, as we discussed earlier.
And having people like Elon Musk involved raises questions about private companies influencing how the government works.
You're absolutely right. That's a valid concern. Billionaires like Musk getting involved in shaping government policies raises important questions about unfair influence and potential conflicts of interest.
So this funding bill seems to be just the beginning. There are all these other factors that could have a massive impact on the future of the U.S. government, its relationship with its citizens, and its role in the 21st century.
That's a perfect way to put it. And like we've seen throughout this deep dive, understanding the full context of this bill, including all the political maneuvering, the potential consequences, the role of technology, and how the public sees it, is crucial for understanding what's happening and what it could mean for all of us down the line.
And on that note of making sense of it all, we still need to talk about what the public thinks about all of this.
You're right. We've talked about how both Democrats and Republicans are trying to present this issue in a way that appeals to their supporters. But how is the public actually reacting? Are people even paying attention? And how could public opinion shape this whole debate as it moves forward? We're going to explore those questions in the last part of our deep dive.
We've talked about a lot in this deep dive, everything from the political maneuvering behind this funding bill to the potential consequences for government programs and the role of tech in reshaping how government works. But it feels like there's something we're missing. We haven't really touched on what the average American thinks about all this.
You're right. Public perception is a really crucial part of the whole picture. We know that both Democrats and Republicans are framing this issue to resonate with their base. But how's the public actually responding? Are people even paying attention? And how might public opinion shape this debate moving forward?
Yeah, exactly. It's easy to get caught up in all the political back and forth in Washington, but ultimately it's the people who are impacted by these decisions. So let's focus on the public's perspective for a bit. What are some of the key trends in public opinion, around government and politics these days?
Well, one trend that's really clear is this growing feeling of distrust and dissatisfaction with the government. This has been building for years now, fueled by things like political polarization, gridlock in Congress, and this sense that the government isn't really listening to the needs of everyday people. And this funding bill, with all the drama and partisan fighting, probably isn't helping to build trust back up.
I can see that. If all you hear about is political fights and gridlock, it's easy to feel like the system is broken and your voice doesn't really matter.
Exactly. And that feeling of disillusionment can lead to apathy and people not being involved in the political process, which is dangerous for any democracy.
So how does this distrust of government tie into public opinion on this specific funding bill?
It's important to remember that people tend to see things through the lens of their political party, especially now with how polarized things are. This means Democrats and Republicans are probably going to have very different views on this bill, even if they agree on some parts of it.
So it's not just about what's in the bill, it's about how it fits into the bigger story that each party is telling.
Right. Both sides are using this fight over funding to really emphasize their main points. Democrats are highlighting how the government needs to step in to protect vulnerable people and make sure society is fair and just. Republicans are emphasizing fiscal responsibility, limited government, and individual freedom. These messages really connect with their supporters and just end up strengthening the partisan divide.
It's like a never-ending cycle. The more polarized we get, the harder it is to find common ground and have productive conversations about these complicated issues.
Absolutely. And for the average person trying to make sense of it all, it can be super confusing and frustrating. It's tough to know what to believe when you're constantly hearing conflicting information from politicians, the media, and social media.
So we have this foundation of distrust and polarization, and then this funding bill comes along and throws gasoline on the fire. What can be done to fix this? Is there any way to bridge this gap between parties and make people trust the government again?
That's a tough one. And there's no simple solution. It would take a lot of different approaches, involving both systemic changes and individual actions.
So what kind of changes are we talking about?
There are many possibilities. Things like campaign finance reform to reduce the influence of money in politics, redistricting reform to make voting districts fairer, and electoral reforms for more transparency and accessibility. These changes could make things more level and make people feel like the system is actually working for them.
Those seem like pretty big fundamental changes. What about individuals? What can regular people do to make a difference?
Well, one of the most important things is to have real conversations with people who have different views. It's easy to stay in our own bubbles, but real change happens when we're willing to listen to and try to understand other perspectives.
It's all about closing that gap and finding common ground even when we don't agree on everything.
Exactly. And it's also important to stay informed about the issues. Contact your elected officials to let them know what you think, and support groups that are trying to get people more involved in politics and make real changes. Democracy needs people to participate, and the more people get involved, the better our chances of creating a government that truly represents everyone.
So it's about being an active and informed citizen, knowing that our voices and actions do matter, even when it doesn't always feel like it. This deep dive has really been eye-opening. We started by looking at one government funding bill, and we ended up talking about the bigger challenges facing U.S. democracy and how technology is changing the future of government.
We've seen how this one event is really a small example of much bigger forces at work. And what we've learned is that understanding the whole context, all the political maneuvering, the potential consequences, the role of tech, and how the public sees it is crucial for navigating this complex world and shaping the future we want.
I think what really stood out to me in this conversation is how much power public pressure has. Both sides in this fight over funding are appealing to different groups of people, which shows that when people get involved, they can really influence what happens in politics.
That's a really important point to remember. In the end, the future of our government depends on its citizens being actively involved. Whether that's voting, reaching out to elected officials, or organizing in your community, every voice makes a difference.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we'll leave you with this question. How will you use your voice to shape the future of the U.S. government? What steps will you take to make sure our democracy stays strong and truly serves the needs of all Americans?
We hope you'll keep thinking about these questions, have meaningful conversations, and take action to build the kind of government you want to see.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into U.S. politics and the future of government. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep learning.